Firstly, welcome and thank you for joining us in the third and final seminar broadcast in the series Unlocking Africa's Potential Through Foresight Modelling. The series is hosted by African Futures and Innovation Programme at the Institute for Security Studies and the Global Future Society. The purpose of the series has been for the African Futures team to present high-level results of extensive modelling on the likely development pathways and long-term potential for Africa using an integrated forecasting modelling platform known as International Futures. I think the links to the website where the results can be seen in much greater detail are going to be posted in the chat. The two previous discussions, geopolitical scenarios and Africa's development potential, I believe have also been posted and maybe in the chat as well. And there was certainly some robust discussion and debate around those topics in the last couple of weeks. Today's topic is unleashing Africa's climate and energy future. Now, the debate around pathways for Africa's energy future in response to climate change, or whether even Africa should be constrained by climate-related pathways, often produces polarizing reviews. So I'm interested to see where this discussion goes. Africa, despite its minimal contribution to global carbon emissions, is projected to be one of the regions most affected by climate change. It contains roughly 18% of the world's population, but produces only some 4% of carbon emissions. The seminar will explore the implications of an African energy transition towards a sustainable future. At present, Africa exports a significant portion of its energy production, coal, oil and gas, while only 57% of its population has access to electricity. And as we know, electrification is going to be a key part to play in this energy transition. So as the continent's population grows and energy demand increases, it is expected to eventually emerge as the largest global carbon emitter. The seminar will examine the implications of transition into renewable energy sources in Africa and the importance of a global carbon tax to finance this transition. My name is Roland Tatnall. I'm the founder of Naimon Capital, where I advise on strategic decision-making for corporates, banks and private equity across energy and infrastructure sectors. And we are joined by three eminent speakers, each of whom will present for 15 minutes, following which there will be half an hour or so of discussion and Q&A. During the presentations, please feel free to write your questions or debate in the chat, but if you wouldn't mind, please keep your microphone muted and camera off unless you're speaking or invited to pose or respond to a question. I should emphasize that the event's being recorded and will be published, so Chatham House rules do not apply. So with that, to our first presenter, Elise Leroux. Elise is a senior researcher in the African Futures and Innovation Programme at the Institute for Security Studies. Over the past 16 years, she has supported various policy and decision makers with long-term planning support. Elise has a wealth of experience in spatial data analysis and holds a master's degree in geographical sciences from the University of Utrecht, specializing in multi-hazard risk assessments. So welcome, Elise. Please turn on your camera and microphone and over to you.
Thanks, Roland. I'm just going to start with a little bit of a background to the African Futures and Innovation team. So our team spends the majority of our time and resources on forecasting development trends in and for Africa countries. We do long-term forecasts to the year 2043, 2050, sometimes even longer, but it really depends on the question that we're trying to answer. So earlier this year, myself and Yaki Silvier, which you will see typing on the chat and answering questions, published two new reports on the future of Africa, specifically Africa's climate and Africa's energy future. So on the screen, I'm displaying our African Futures and Innovation portal, and both of these reports are available under the thematic section, the climate and the energy links here. And I do invite you to download them and to browse them, and you will see it's interactive reports. There's lots of forecasts and graphs and tables in those reports. And it is worth noting that all of those forecasts that you will be able to engage with were produced using the International Futures Platform, or the IFS model for short, which is a global integrated assessment model and all of our forecasts are quantitative in nature. So these two reports that we published, myself and Yaki, are quite bulky. So I am briefly going to take you through just a combined highlighted version within the next 10 minutes or so. Okay, just going to open them up here. So I think everybody on this call is very, very familiar and acutely aware of the escalating climate crisis. I mean, just one day of either reading the news or listening to the news would make the severity of the situation very clear. So Monday is now officially, this past Monday, the hottest day ever recorded globally. And I think what's concerning is on Tuesday, where there's an article saying Sunday was the hottest day. So with each passing day, we seem to be breaking these records day on day, year on year. Last year, half a days in 2023 surpassed the 1.5 degrees Celsius threshold that we were aiming for. And in November, in end of last year, we very briefly, the world reached that 2 degrees Celsius critical threshold as well. Also, if we look at scientific publications coming out on a daily basis, scientists are now publishing attribution studies where it's clear that a lot of the weather events and severe weather events that we are observing have a direct link to a shifting global climate. And I think what is concerning is that despite this very growing awareness, our CO2 emissions continue to rise year on year. Globally, CO2 emissions from fossil fuel last year reached 36.1 billion tons, and the atmospheric CO2 concentration reached around 424 parts per million. So just after that recorded record there. To keep the 1.5 degrees Celsius Paris goal alive, I want to place this in context. Atmospheric CO2 concentrations should be between 330 and 400 parts per million. So that's this light blue line here on the screen. Our current forecast at the African Futures Innovation Team using the IFS model suggests a worrying trend that we will end anywhere around by 2050 at around 515 parts per million. And currently, we also know that around 70% of all global fossil fuel emissions are coming from just 10 countries. These are the US, India, Russia, Japan, Indonesia, Iran, Germany, Saudi Arabia, and South Korea. And Africa, as a continent, all of its 55 member states are producing less than 5% of these global emissions. So we are expecting or forecasting that emissions will peak at around 2033, thereabouts, so within less than a decade from now. Then it will plateau, before it starts gradually declining. Africa's share of these global emissions is set to increase, we know this, significantly, from less than the current 5% to around 11% by 2050, and then potentially reaching around 16% by 2063. In 2023, South Africa, Egypt, Nigeria, and Algeria, these 4 countries accounted for around 70% of Africa's fossil fuel carbon emissions. So we are forecasting that the picture will change. I mean, South Africa's share will start decreasing significantly, owing to its decarbonization plan to around 7% by mid-century, Algeria roughly to around 5% by mid-century, Egypt will contribute roughly around 14% by mid-century, but Nigeria will contribute roughly around 20% by mid-century, also making it, I think, the 4th largest emitter by mid-century. So Nigeria really is emerging as a significant key point for Africa in terms of its fight against reducing carbon emissions. So this anticipated increase in emissions really is driven by factors we know, such as rapid population growth, expanded industrial activities, rising energy demand. And to address these challenges and to mitigate the impact on global climate, the transition to sustainable energy sources, is paramount. And that's much of the discussion that we'll have today as well. And I'm going to get into that in a minute, but just to state that I want to take you through some of the policies that we looked at in terms of how we can address some of these issues. And one of the things that the IMF, the World Bank, and several African leaders have been calling for is a global carbon tax framework. So we modeled this and we looked at the impact of a global carbon tax framework on global emissions. We specifically modeled 4 carbon tax scenarios, which really reflects much of the ongoing thinking around carbon taxing currently. and a lot of the debate that we're seeing. So the first scenario that we modeled was a wealthy pay scenario, where we say that wealthy nations are where they are because of historical emissions and that they should be taxed accordingly. The second scenario looks at what we call a high polluter scenario, where we say we target the world's top 20 global emitters, which is responsible for roughly around 80% of all emissions. And then the third approach, we said, no, this is a collective response, and there should be a minimum carbon pricing floor, and all countries should participate in this. And then a fourth scenario, where we said a differentiated pay scenario, where countries are taxed according to their income status. And you have a differentiated pay scenario, anything from $25 all the way up to $100 per ton of carbon. So we modeled these four, and I think what was clear from the modeling results, and this is also in the energy or in the climate report, and you can read the results in more detail there, was that if we are to implement a global carbon tax framework, it needs to be a global effort. Otherwise, we will see issues such as carbon leakages, we will see higher emission standards, or just slightly reduced emission standards. But the differentiated pay scenario, where all countries participate, but differentiated based on their income levels, really is the one that makes the largest impact and that holds the biggest key to reducing carbon from a carbon tax perspective. So we are forecasting that it does hold the promise of reducing carbon emissions by around 15% by 2050 and around 25% by the year 2063. And it is so it is a worthwhile and a noteworthy ambition. Currently, only around 6% of GHG emissions on the globe are covered by a carbon tax. So this is definitely something that is should be taken up. It is a valuable tool, but again, on its own, it will not suffice. So the forecasting does show even implementing something like a differentiated carbon tax framework, the levels of CO2 in the atmosphere will still exceed 500 parts per million by the year 2050. So much, much more is needed. And this would include things like natural and artificial carbon sequestration. For Africa, this means the protection of its vast forest lands that acts as a carbon sink, but also the protection of its grassy ecosystems that also holds a lot of carbon within them. Better land use management, promoting sustainable agriculture, and then, of course, accelerating the energy transition, rapidly shifting towards cleaner energy sources, which really brings me to Africa's energy and poverty dilemma. Africa's growing population, we know, faces significant energy poverty. Roland started off the discussion with this, but essentially, only 57% of Africa's population has access to electricity, leaving around 600 million people on the continent without essential resources for heating and cooking and just basic access to energy. So in contrast, so this is 57% of Africa's population has access. The population outside of Africa, there's 98% of the population that has access to electricity. So there's a vast discrepancy there. And I think energy poverty, particularly in Africa, is very pronounced in countries like Central African Republic, Chad, South Sudan, and these are just to name three. And energy is, we know, crucial for economic growth and human development. Rapid human development typically requires around 8.6 barrels of oil equivalent per person annually. Currently, Africa averages around 3.2 barrels of oil equivalent, and this is compared to a global average of 13.6 barrels of oil. So this advancement and the improvement in living conditions on the continent really requires energy. But we have to bear in mind the fact that Africa population is growing very rapidly and will double in the next 3 or so decades. Africa's energy production also remains, I think the second thing we need to realize, it's very, very reliant on fossil fuels currently. In 2023, and this is the graph that I have up here on the screen, renewables contributed, let's just go to that slide there. Renewables contributed around 1.7% to the total energy mix. Oil accounted for around 46.6%, while gas accounted for 31%, and coal still stood at around 17.6%. So the transition to renewables will take years, if not decades, to gain sufficient momentum to replace the fossil fuel use as a viable energy source on the African continent. So the United Nations Environmental Programme released a report last year that they called the 2023 Production Gap Report. And in there, they state that to keep the ambition of the Paris Agreement alive, we need to phase out coal completely by 2040. We need a reduction of oil and gas production to a quarter of the levels we observed in 2020 by the year 2050. And these goals we know are crucial. I mean, they are really crucial in our fight against climate change, our global climate stability. They pose economic challenges. That's a reality for nations heavily invested in fossil fuels. So for Africa, there are around 20 countries or states, actually, that's heavily dependent on fossil fuel production for energy or fossil fuels for energy production and for exports. So we looked at the UNEP report. We modeled this. We looked at the impact of the UNEP recommendations for Africa and for Africa member states, and we modeled this. So we looked at reducing fossil fuels like they proposed in the UNEP report, phasing out coal by 2040, oil, gas production to 25% the levels we observed in 2020, to increase renewables really significantly fourfold in the next decade or so. We looked at things like energy efficiency, implementing that in the model, as well as the ability of carbon sequestration, both natural and artificial processes. So we built the scenario and we modeled what would be the impact of that for the African continent. The reality is that the implementation of these recommendations, as outlined in the UNEP report, would have significant implications for African countries that currently depends on fossil fuel production. You can see in this graph that I have here on the screen, we've got the blue line, which is the business as usual, the current path for Africa's total energy production all the way out to 2063, and then what it would be under the UNEP production or the UNEP report recommendations. So this again bears in mind that we will end coal by the year 2040 and a significant reduction in gas and oil and an increase, a really vast increase in renewables and more energy efficiency. But the result is roughly around 5.9 billion barrels of oil production gap, what Africa would need and that it would fall short of. So Africa needs energy. Its population is growing very rapidly, and currently technologies does hold the answer and the solution, but it's not rapidly enough to meet current demand. So phasing out all forms of fossil fuels will prove challenging for Africa and for the continent, and it will constrain Africa's development. Again, just reiterating that implementing all of the UNEP recommendations globally could also result in higher energy import costs for Africa and reduced export earnings. So the report, the energy report specifically, that's also on the website, does go into detail on using gas specifically as a transition energy source, while renewables and modern technologies like hydrogen or SMNR technologies are catching up. And I think there's quite a strong argument within that report why gas should be used as the transition fuel for Africa in the next couple of decades. So in summary, I think, Roland, just to summarize the discussion up until now, again, we acknowledge that Africa has significant potential for renewable energy in technology advancements, solar, bulk solar from the Sahara, green hydrogen, SMNR technologies that's currently being developed and that will be deployed in the next couple of years. But we are also saying that this is still a decade or so from being implemented on a full scale. But the challenge is Africa's reliance on fossil fuel currently, its use and its exports, the insufficient support for a green transition from external actors, and the insufficient support in terms of financing. And we are arguing that natural gas will remain crucial for many African nations in the next 3 decades to meet their development challenges. And this will complicate the shift to a much quicker, lower emissions pathway, but it also raises a question around investments in gas and the issue of stranded assets. So to address these questions, Africa really is going to need a balancing act in terms of reducing fossil fuel dependency on the one hand, and then meeting its energy demands. So there's many things happening, lots of investments in renewables, but the investment in renewables, seeking international support for financing behind this really needs to be scaled up dramatically going forward. There's a lot of attention also, I think, on the continent, but there is a lot more attention needed in terms of things like land management practices, specifically forest and and grassy ecosystems. They specifically hold a great contribution for Africa in terms of acting as a carbon sink or carbon sequestration for the next couple of decades. And they really are vital in our global fight. And both of these reports really have a lot of recommendations in them. Again, I invite you to download these reports, to reach out to us, to go through them and to ask us any questions. And I think when we get into the Q&A, we can also unpack many of these. And Yaki is also online to help answer some of these energy questions. Okay, Roland, I am going to stop there for time and hand over to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Elise. I know it was a very quick overview of a lot of information that you've put together on the website and in a variety of other presentations that are there on the website. But I think what was interesting, there were three things that stood out there for me. It was one that probably not unsurprisingly, the greatest carbon reductions, according to your modeling, in terms of a global carbon tax, are going to be from a differentiated carbon tax, so spread between wealthy and not so wealthy or poor countries. Lower carbon taxes for poorer countries and higher for the wealthier countries. That's maybe not so surprising. Maybe one of the more surprising results of your forecast seems to be that there's going to need to be a lot of mechanisms to drive carbon reduction if that's what we're seeking globally, and carbon tax is just one of them. I think you had the greatest reductions for 2063, down from about 15 billion tons currently to about 5 billion tons then. So there's still a big gap that we need to find other mechanisms to push those carbon emissions down. And then I think one of the things that was maybe a little bit surprising for me is that you are predicting Africa's emissions to grow quite significantly over the next 40 odd years or so, whereas the rest of the world is correspondingly decreasing their emissions. And you obviously didn't highlight what different regions were doing other than Africa. So I'm not sure whether in those areas where in the rest of the world, where there is on average global reductions in emissions, whether some regions are going to be increasing their emissions, or whether the assumption is the whole of the rest of the world in aggregation is going to reduce emissions, and individually regions are also going to reduce emissions. But a very interesting presentation, I think, to kick things off. So thank you for that, Elise. Our next speaker, our second speaker, Tanya Hichert, is an academically qualified, highly experienced futures and foresight practitioner. In addition to running the Hichert and Associates Futures Foresight Consulting firm for the past 18 years, Tanya is a fellow at the Center for Sustainability Transitions, where she is co-chair of the UNESCO Chair in Complex Systems and Transformative African Futures at Stellenbosch University. Now, Tanya also served a term as strategic foresight advisor for the United Nations Development Programme. So a lot of experience there. I'm looking forward to your presentation, Tanya.
Thank you, Roland, and good morning, good afternoon, everybody from a sunny Cape Town for a change. I'm going to just share my screen. Give me a second to do that. There we go. And oh, there we go. Right. So watching the clock, what I'd like to do is just add a perspective to this superb work that ISS is doing, and that Elise has just shared with us. And if you haven't done so, I really urge you to read those thematic reports on climate and energy. They're absolutely brilliant, and the type of data in there is worth its weight in gold. What I'm wanting to do by adding a perspective, and I'm very much wearing my Futures Foresight hat for this, you know, I'm neither a climate nor energy expert, is that there are additional ways of framing these futures and thinking about them and talking about them. And I want to throw an extra one in the pot. And it doesn't for 1 second imply that one throws sort of foresight modeling work out the window, not at all. The reason for adding this is just it can be very effective when one wants to involve more and more diverse stakeholders than just, for example, say, policymakers or governance institutions and that perspective. So adding a perspective here. And it's one of transformative foresight. And the reason is that the scope of our planetary crisis, and we're going to feel that crisis, I think, more acutely on the African continent, calls for urgent, far-reaching, and unprecedented transformations of systems and cultures. So not just transition, as we're going through this energy transition, which is a clear example of a transition, but actual transformation, different ways of thinking about how we tackle this crisis. And one of the ways one can employ is by looking at sort of more creative and participatory methods, very qualitative, where we use imagination to engage in alternatives. So the other element that I want to add is that we're dealing with complexity on steroids. So this energy transition and the climate change impacts, these are hallmark complex issues. And a complexity approach tells us that things are very often, most often, non-linear. And by bringing this sort of non-linearity into play, we're able to start working in a practical manner, because with futures and foresight, you want to work in a practical, structured, and systematic manner with futures that do not exist yet. And you're able to start working with this non-linearity, so tipping points, reinforcing feedback loops, emergence, these sort of things. You're able to work with that using transformative foresight approaches. So, here we go. I've made the point already. Non-linear is emergence, tipping points. And essentially, they're unpredictable because it's the way these elements and nodes in complex systems interact with one another that something very small can trigger large effects, but we have no idea what that might be. So this requires different ways of working and approaching. So transformative foresight, here's a little definition. It's a very specific form of foresight practice that utilizes diverse sets of foresight methods. And we're doing a lot of this at the Center at Stellenbosch University with students, with transdisciplinary groups in workshops. And the aim is to develop novel paths in the present with indeterminate outcomes. Now, I know that sounds a little bit fluffy. The point is these indeterminate outcomes very often are framed as radically different futures, but preferred futures. So essentially, what are the things that we need to envision, imagine on the African continent to make change happen? So this little bit of theory thing's going to end soon, and then I'm going to show some examples, and it would be lovely to engage some of this perspective into the questions and the conversation. So essentially, transformative foresight approaches help us transcend our current thinking patterns and normative framings, and that one does want to start looking at completely new, unimaginable transformations. So how does one start that pathway to something that is completely different from the present? So just on the point of non-linearity, I mean, we've seen this before. You all know this. These extremely steep hockey stick curves where one system just very suddenly in very few years can replace another completely. And this slide, by the way, is from the Rocky Mountain Institute. They released recently a superb piece of research and a fantastic slide deck to go along with it, looking at energy transition and how suddenly this some of it can happen and what we to expect. So, look at this transition from cast iron to steel. They call it the X-shaped pattern. steamships surpassing sailing ships, horses and cars. We all know this kind of thing. And how we are at some point in the future in the African continent, we're going to see this X kick in with regard to energy. And transformative foresight is really all about how do we bring that forward? How do we envision it? How do we navigate that turbulent change that goes along with this one system replacing another? Just another little example again from Rocky Mountain Institute. Here you can see these incredibly steep curves looking at compound annual growth rates of wind generation, solar generation, battery storage. So this is at the global level. We know this, and the speakers have just referred to this. Africa still has a big gap. But the point is, in the future, this exact same phenomenon is going to happen. So I thought I'd agonize terribly about whether to show the slide or not, but it is useful, I think. It's essentially a framework to show us where is transformative foresight placed with regard to other ways of working. For example, the foresight modeling. So, for example, all of the work that ISS is doing and the superb data and that analysis falls into sort of this frame here. Predictive, looking at an assessment of probabilities of futures outcomes, looking at likelihoods, exploring uncertain futures by positioning alternatives, and essentially using that modeling framework to do this. So it's a predictive and scenaric frame. Transformative foresight is right there out at the top right, which is all about working with open systems, meaning radically open, so complex systems. And the aim here is to generate novel paths in the present with indeterminate outcomes. So kind of working with futures that are out there and not part of a probability or a likelihood based on inputs and variables that we know exist already. And the very important point is up here in the top left. It's all about normative influencing. Working from a transformative frame means you're not neutral. It involves actively driving change towards a future that's significantly different from the current status quo. And I'll use the futures cone there. I saw in the audience, there's a lot of people from the futures world, so you'll be familiar with this. Those of you that are not from the futures world, futures people like this, love this futures cone, which tells us that if we are here now in the present, of course, there's history, and history is a cone too, because there's different histories, different interpretations of histories. But if we hear the unfolding future, time going forward, and as time goes further forward, you get a wider range of different futures. And you can see here the projected future, the blue. This is an extrapolated baseline. So the foresight modeling work is working with a projected future and then very much probable as well, and touches as well on preferable, because that modeling work, there are definitely scenarios in there that are preferable for the African continent when it comes to energy and climate futures. So it's in this scope here. The argument I'm making to add into this is let's work with preposterous futures as well, radically different from the present, and very much radically preferable futures as well. And then you can see these have value judgments to them. What is it we want to happen? What should be happening? What is good for human development on the African continent to happen? And preposterous, I always use the argument that we're living in a preposterous present. We've seen some really weird and wonderful, just look at a virus jumps from one species to another in a market in China, and look where that landed us. These small things that can happen can turn a present preposterous very quickly. We should be working. My colleague Wendy Schultz calls this crazy futures. So with an eye on time, just to say quickly, there is some superb work happening in this space, specifically with regard to the Anthropocene. So the Anthropocene is this new geological epoch, this era that we're entering. We're exiting the Holocene, which has been good for us as humanity and our development and the climate. And it's given us all our systems and infrastructures that we have on planet Earth. We're busy exiting that. We are entering the Anthropocene, where human activity is affecting planetary systems. And now the big question here, of course, is how do we get to decent levels of human development on the African continent without breaching planetary boundaries? I mean, it's a real conundrum. This requires thinking and working in ways that are definitely not mainstream, that are not out there. But to start engaging around this is some of the work that we've been doing. And you know, here is the argument in a nutshell. Conventional development paradigm is based on exploitation of nature, continuous production and consumption, and privatization of common resources. And that's just not possible anymore. These resources that we have on the African continent, I'm going to sound a bit blunt now, are needed for our survival. And the point is, because this is really difficult and unimaginable, it leads to very dystopian stories of the future. And we see this specifically a bit more often in Western nations, if you think of the movies we're watching. Now, the point is, stories and images of the futures are very powerful things, because the image we have of a future influences our decision-making and choices that we have in the present. So there is this need for visions of good Anthropocenes. And to get those, we work with what we call bright spots. In Futures Foresight language, it's horizon scanning. We look for weak signals. And specifically outside of the mainstream, we look for, where is it possible? Are there little examples, little experiments, ideas of how one can have this human development within planetary boundaries? And on the back of that, we've developed methodology and tools to work with this, and we've had quite a number of these sort of engagements. And here's just the definition of seeds, these bright spots, pockets of the future in the present. They can be small-scale experimental projects and initiatives, and they employ new ways of thinking and doing. Now, for example, the speaker following me, James, I'm nearly done, I'm watching the clock, is going to talk about hydrogen. Well, that's a seed. It can change things dramatically. We see examples of microgrids in Nigeria. We see some wonderful work in a township just outside of Stellenbosch in Kanini, where spatial planning is used with the objective of saving scarce energy resources, and so it goes on. So I'll put the link in the chat. There's a database of these seeds that we're working with. The point is, they're niche, they're marginal, not yet mainstream, but if one works with them and transformative foresight methodology, we have an idea of, are there things that have potential to improve likelihoods and sustainability outcomes? So just very quickly, transformative foresight helps us to make sense of complex, multidimensional systemic change, these transitions. It helps us identify inflection points, you know, which seeds do we fertilize? Gives us the beginnings of what can be done. Even if we take small steps, at least have an idea of a pathway to a preferred future. We're able to engage around radically different futures from radically different perspectives and produce outputs that embody systemic change, transformation, and complex systems futures. And then, of course, spaces for co-learning and cross-sector collaboration. And the emphasis here is that we're not just going to be needing governance institutions and policymakers. We're going to need all hands on deck in terms of creating the kind of future we want on the African continent. This quote is ascribed to Einstein. It's difficult to verify, but apparently he said we cannot solve our problems with the same thinking we used when we created them, so we add these new different types of thinking. And I'm ending off by just saying, in a complex world, small changes can have massive effects. Often we think about this in terms of risk. Something small goes wrong, you know, a big cargo ship blocks the Suez Canal and it has a ripple effect around global supply chains, but it works the opposite way as well. Often small changes, positive changes, can have massive effects. I'm done. Thank you very much. Roland, over to you.
Thanks, Tanya. Maybe we should have had that first, because that was a very interesting introduction into foresight and how it relates to futures and the discussion that we're having at the moment. But that was very useful for me, because I'm certainly a foresight neophyte, fact, I'm probably a futures neophyte. But there are a couple of points there that were quite interesting. I like the graphs on the X graphs of the crossovers, and they were all UK related though. And I think if you showed the same graphs for China, for example, especially the bottom right one, which is coal versus gas, then, or even coal versus renewables, which is at an X point in some countries, you wouldn't see that X until some point in the future. You'd see them both increasing together, I think. And then your comment on a preposterous present, I like that. I think I don't think too many people would disagree with that, but I think it does sort of highlight when you're looking at the foresight way of thinking, that the cone starts with a single point in the future, in the present, which sort of implies that we're all starting from the same place. And then when you mention the preposterous present, I think that implies that that's not necessarily always the case, which brings challenges if we're trying to push forward together to try and make the changes that you're suggesting. And I think that also brings another question, which is potentially we're seeing the world arguably, maybe not even arguably, move away from bipolar sort of hegemonic type states to multipolar fragmentation. And if that's the case, and we're proposing something like a global carbon tax, then or anything that needs global agreement, how do we navigate that given the multipolar world that we're seeing at the moment? But very interesting and certainly useful for me. So thank you very much, Tanya. And then our final speaker, and I hesitate to say we're saving the best to last, but maybe that's the case. I don't know. James Manupe. James is the economic advisor to the Namibian president and also Namibia's Green Hydrogen Commissioner. James contributes to the nation's strategic planning process that aims to diversify Namibia's exports in order to weather exogenous shocks. He has been instrumental in unlocking blended concessionary financing capital to enable the construction of regionally important strategic assets that will support the upcoming wave of low carbon manufacturing in Namibia. Mr. Manupe holds an executive certificate in economic development from the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, is a CFA charter holder, a chartered accountant, and a certified financial planner. Thank you, James. Over to you.
Excellent. Thanks a lot for having us, and I'm assuming, Roland, you can hear me well. Excellent, fantastic. So I'm going to try and have a conversation with everyone, and not focus too much on a presentation. But I am going to be sharing my screen nonetheless, and I will try and share with you sections of a blueprint that we have prepared as part of our mandate as economic advisor to the head of state, that was essentially trying to, look at whether indeed this global energy transition can indeed present essentially offensive opportunities for Namibia to grow its economy, versus looking at it as a potentially very punishing journey, which is going to decarbonize the continent. I mean, I think Roland made an extremely interesting point to say, look, some of the earlier slides we were looking at were hinting that while the rest of the world would decarbonize, Africa would either decarbonize slower or not decarbonize enough, and therefore its potential share of global emissions is going to be decreasing. That will have consequences economically, because what we're seeing around the world is trends such as the carbon border adjustment mechanism are actually going to be looking to discriminate on goods based on their carbon content. So when your goods have a high carbon content, you're likely going to be taxed more, and that obviously might have an impact on your competitiveness as a country. So what did we do in Namibia? First of all, it's very fair to say that Namibia is a very tiny country from an economic perspective. We're 3 million people. We use about 4.5 terawatt hours of electricity. We import most of that electricity from our neighborhood, which is not great because our neighborhood is energy insecure in itself, but that's useful context. However, we do have 824,000 square kilometers to ourselves. So we're the second least densely populated country in the world. we also happen to have a shore with the Atlantic Ocean. So we try to use all of those characteristics to our advantage. The paper essentially would go ahead and provide a bit of a background as to who we are and where we've come from. We identified a new growth agenda, and then we delivered a blueprint that would try and capture that growth agenda. So the early part of the presentation really looks at all of the strides we've made since independence. I won't spend too much time on that. It does recognize that we have a bit of a middle income trap in terms of our growth prospect relative to our peers. It then, very honestly, if I may say so myself, looks at the 5 key binding constraints. What are the issues that really do impact our ability to grow very, very fast? We can see there from the first 2 that low productivity and, of course, human capital mismatches is something that stands out. But if you look at number 5, climate change is actually a real issue as well. And given just the context of our discussions today, I'll concentrate on that a little bit. We then go ahead and deep dive into each of those constraints for some context. But if I look at climate change, 2 things stand out for Namibia. I think it was mentioned in the earlier presentations that climate change does affect the African continent disproportionately. You can see there, they're receding rainfall patterns here for Namibia. Our largest energy producer is a hydropower station in the north western part of the country. And so you do get essentially a double whammy from climate change, right? In that when we get these protracted, unpredictable, and really, really sort of deadly droughts, you end up with having to subsidize the agricultural sector, which is a huge employer. So we try and help our farmers. This year, we're spending 800 million Namibian dollars, sort of that was unbudgeted for, to try and subsidize the farmers. But at the same time, you find yourself in a position where you're importing electricity from the region in an urgent and unplanned manner, paying a higher price for that electricity. We currently import anywhere between 60 to 70% of our electricity from our neighbors here in South Africa, Zambia, Zimbabwe, etc. Right? So climate change for us, given that our largest generator, 70% of our generation capacity comes from hydroelectricity, climate change is a real issue. So it makes us energy insecure, and of course, it reduces our productive capacity as a country. So what's the new opportunity? Well, we have noticed that there's a significant amount of capital that is indeed looking for assets that are going to be driven by renewable energy. We've noted, of course, as we're noting in this discussion, that the energy transition is a real thing, and that decarbonized targets are actually becoming legislated in various jurisdictions that we trade with. So Europe is one that we will talk about often, but we know that South Korea, the United States, and others are actually looking at this. There is a paper by the African Climate Foundation that actually notes the negative economic impact a tax like the carbon border adjustment mechanism in Europe will have on African exports. And actually the main beneficiaries of something like that would be China, would essentially, that is decarbonizing their manufacturing base faster than us, would end up replacing a lot of our exports to a jurisdiction such as Europe that will start to curb down on carbon intensive goods. So
sorry to interrupt, James. Just you're becoming a little muffled at times. I'm not sure if it's the headset or.
Okay. I will try and actually not use my headphones at the moment. Is that better?
Yeah, that's better. Thank you.
All right. So let's go back to our screen here. So one of the things we then decided really to is that, of course, there is a continental aspect to this, but at the same time, there's a global aspect to this. Namibia, given its relative position on the African continent, can contribute idiosyncratically to Agenda 2063, which essentially talks about continental infrastructure being developed in cognizance, or at least in tandem with your neighbors. So for example, if you look at some of the assets that we want to develop with regards to our ports, those ports would be connections for inland or hinterland African nations. And of course, we think we can start trading interesting goods with each other that are indeed in and of themselves have a lower carbon content. So, for example, a hydrogen pipeline between Namibia and South Africa, where Namibia can give hydrogen to a player like Sasol, which is, of course, the continent's largest single emitter, would be a very interesting addition in terms of our exports. And this for a country that typically imports from South Africa. If we can export high-value products like that, that helps us all decarbonize and become more competitive, and of course increase the demand for its goods around the world, that would be a very interesting development for us as well. Of course, we have our own developmental agendas. So Agenda 2063, or at least 2030 for us, essentially says that Namibia needs to become more of a manufacturing-based nation and less of a nation that relies on the primary sector of the economy, exporting minerals, oil and gas, uranium, diamonds, those sort of things. And at the same time, it needs to be labor intensive. So something that can create essentially 500,000 jobs sort of in the next 7 years or so. That in itself is a big deal for us, because we only have about 350,000 formally employed people today. So whatever solution I would come up with as an economic advisor would need to try and hit some of these targets. And as we sat down and discussed this issue with my principal and other members of cabinet, this was an emerging vision that came out, and this is really the centerpiece of the discussion I wanted to have with you, which was Namibia realized that we can become a renewable energy hub that can export green energy to its neighbors. In so doing, our neighbors can use that green energy to valorize some of their own goods and minerals. So whether it is taking the platinum or using that in electrolyzers from South Africa, Zimbabwe, or indeed the cobalt and the copper could be used in power stations, but also as battery precursors in Zambia. If you make those goods with clean energy, they have a low carbon signature. And then, of course, they can be traded through our strategic ports, be it Walvis Bay or Lüderitz in the southern part of Namibia. That, of course, then gives you preferential or competitive market access to markets that are becoming more and more carbon sensitive. So the vision essentially came out saying, look, Namibia likely would have more clean energy than it can use. It therefore needs to build systems that can export that energy, use some of that energy in Namibia as well to valorize some of our own minerals, to make some of our own clean goods, and then trade with the rest of the world. And so with that sort of vision, we then went on to create the blueprint that says what infrastructure will be needed to make that happen and what new investable industries would start emerging. It became quite clear that we needed to make strategic investment in our rail, our ports, green hydrogen hubs, electricity, and of course, industrial zones that could then host some of these industries. The blueprint goes and details each of these pieces of infrastructure and what exactly we've done to mobilize the funding for that. And then excitedly, these are new industries that we think begin to emerge that are potential upsides for Namibia. So whether it is solar panel manufacturing, electrolyzer manufacturing, wind turbine assembly or manufacturing, or indeed mineral beneficiation such as lithium and rare earth elements, we have both of those. Both of those are considered critical raw minerals for the energy transition. Industries like flat glass, which are essentially looking for low carbon solutions, but are energy intensive. So maybe we could use our gas to essentially create a flat glass hub in Namibia. And then, of course, the green hydrogen derivatives, which are synthetic fuels such as ammonia, but even hot briquetted iron, where we actually use the hydrogen in Namibia to actually reduce the oxygen content of the iron ore and make direct reduced iron. As I start closing, in a nutshell, this blueprint map is what has emerged. What you can see is actually Namibia is not looking to export hydrogen as everyone is thinking. We are going to be using the hydrogen and the clean energy to valorize some of our minerals. Some of these assets already exist. The industrial valleys, we're calling them, have already emerged. We are now having key players in those industries beginning to develop some of their products, including the first hot briquetted iron production facility, or at least direct reduced iron production facility as we know it in the world. We're beginning to receive the kiln or the furnace for that in September. Custom-made furnace that will use hydrogen to reduce iron ore. Very excited about that. But importantly, we've also started mobilizing a blended financing infrastructure fund that would raise cheaper capital to help us develop some of our infrastructure networks, some of our, such as our ports and our rails as well. So in a nutshell, if you do this well, I'll finish with this. You can actually use climate change or the trend of climate change to attract a significant amount of FDI, to diversify your exports, grow your GDP, and create jobs, while at the same time abating a significant amount of carbon dioxide, which of course really helps sort of decarbonize our planet. Now, one of the things I will say as I sort of my closing comments is a lot of what I've shared has actually translated into live projects today. So we've sort of gone beyond the theoretical. And for those of you who do follow me on LinkedIn, you can see the updates on the projects, whether it is the hydrogen service station, High Iron, Hyphen is doing great. So it's quite imperative now for Namibia to start sharing these updates with the rest of the continent, because if you look at, say, for example, the port asset we'll be building with the second largest port in Europe, in Walvis Bay with the port of Antwerp, that port could be a strategic connector for export products from Zambia and DRC. And so Namibia shouldn't be looking to develop that port for itself and on its own, but rather in concert and in constant conversation with our neighbors. And we have seen Netherlands and Belgium do this very strategically for Europe. Those are projects in Europe that are considered international projects of common European interest, IPCEI, and then they mobilize very cheap funding to build these strategic assets that have a sort of common benefit for the region. So these are the sort of conversations I think we need to have more and more in Africa. And then lastly, to not look at the energy transition merely as a painful tax. So this is sort of really what I wanted to share with you. I do see people are asking for the presentation. We will be looking to launch that next week by the 31st of July. You should be able to find it on gh2namibia.com. The letter GH, the number 2, namibia.com. We've uploaded a lot of our research there, and we're hoping to interact with you deeply on some of that going forward. Roland, let me stop there. I think I've clocked my 15 minutes. Hopefully that was a bit insightful for a few of your listeners. Thank you.
Thank you, James. Perfect timing. I want to thank all of the presenters for sticking to their limits. I think that's a first. But that was a fascinating presentation, James, and I know it's a lot more comprehensive than I'm impressed how you dealt with such a comprehensive topic. And what was particularly impressive, I think, was Namibia has this sort of macro, high-level industrial climate energy policy, but the micro examples that you give of the wins that you're actually achieving on the ground to sort of support and justify and enable that policy is particularly impressive as well. And I think from sitting in South Africa, we've for a few years, maybe not quite a few years, but for a few years now, we've looked enviously at your industrial energy policy and the positivity that it sort of shows, because I think we hear a lot of negativity in South Africa about the transition and what could go wrong, and obviously a lot could go wrong, but the way Namibia seems to embracing it is to look at it positively and see how the change can actually bring the benefits that other changes and transitions in Namibia's history maybe haven't brought it. So very, very interesting presentation and conversation. Thank you, James. So I think we can now open or move on to the Q&A discussion. And there've been a few points raised on the chat. If anyone wants to raise their hand and ask a question, then please be my guest. Otherwise, I'll just curate a couple of the questions or some of the themes that maybe have come through. I don't see any hands. So one of the earliest sort of themes that came through from the chat, I think, was all very well having a global proposing a global carbon tax, but is there any sense of how that will be enacted? Who will enact it? How will that tax be collected? Who will regulate it, monitor it, and how will the funds be distributed? Because it's clearly a progressive taxation system. It's a redistributive taxation system that is looking to not just tax at a local level, but to have a global impact with the monies raised. So I don't know if there are any of the panelists who can respond to that.
Roland, I'll start contributing to the discussion. So I've read the discussion in the chat function. And there's just a couple of points that I want to make regarding the carbon tax debate. And I think for one is that it is not a solution, but it is a contribution, but a small contribution to the many solutions that we need to tackle this problem. So I agree with lots of the debate around it creates weird behavior and so forth. And I mean, we're seeing this. I mean, the 6% of GHG emissions that's currently being taxed does create weird behaviors, carbon leakages, and our policies to correct those policies and those issues. So that's why I think the one thing was that it's very important that it's a global carbon tax framework to avoid many of the issues that has sprung up with this very fragmented approach that we've seen. But also what the modeling clearly showed is it is a nice way of generating revenue. And I think there was a lot of discussion. I think it was Nicholas, that asked the question around, so what do you do with these funds? And indeed, the suggestion in the report is as well that the more wealthier nations help the developing nations in the energy transition and making those funds available, while the developed nations, in terms of their revenue that they've generated, use those for domestic needs, adaptation needs specifically, because I think that's something we haven't talked about, but I'll address that in a second. So again, carbon tax makes a difference. It's a very small difference. So that's why we're saying it's only one of the many solutions that really needs to be implemented. And I agree with Tanya, but also says we need, many novel solutions, many new solutions. And that's why a presentation like what James gave is very exciting. And I think that's the type of things that one would like to see emerging from the African continent. Many of our forecasts are, I think, slightly more pessimistic towards the climate future, meaning that the debate that we have not had is that a lot of these investments would also have to be channeled towards adaptation. And that would be vitally important in the next decade as well. So that was just to address my contribution to the carbon tax debate.
I don't know if Tanya or James have a view. I know James, you're not proposing a global carbon tax to benefit Namibia, but I don't know if either of you have any comments on your thoughts on how such a thing could be implemented and whether it's the right way to go.
So, one of the things, if you listen to sort of the comments, there are two things that stand out to me that one's very, it's important for us as Africans to know. One noted, the revenue could be used to help African nations transition, etc. It's not very often people help people, right? So I think one has to wear a very business-minded hat sometimes with these things. And so what do I mean by that? So when we started thinking of all these assets that we need to finance, but also to develop, we knew that we would have to do it in such a way that is economically attractive to OEMs, to off-takers, to port operators, etc. They wouldn't do it because they felt obligated, given that they polluted the world. They would do it if they would make some money, right? And so one has to sort of start wearing that frame of mind to say, how can we make money for us as Africans, Namibians, people from Southern Africa, across the whole continent? But how can they also make money as well? And if you do that, you start to move the wheel a little bit faster. So that's the first. The second is the whole global world tax thing. It's kind of happening anyway. So CBAM to me is a bit of a global tax on carbon. And that's because within the EU, they're going to tax their industries. And now they're saying, if I tax the EU industries, but I don't tax those who are importing into the EU, I'm going to lose all of my industries in the EU. And the truth is the EU is the largest trading bloc in the world. So whether we like it or not, they do have an EU ETS, an EU emissions trading system that has a price on tax. And that price went from like 80, some are saying it could go to 120. So I actually look at that as a global tax almost, right? But I think, because I think the US and others are looking at something similar. What do they do with that money? They have a fund called an EU Innovation Fund. And the argument is, look, they could use that to help their own industries decarbonize, but importantly, they could also use that to help other nations, emerging nations like in Africa, to also speed up their transition. So I look at it as, whether I like it or not, it's going to happen. They've already written it into their legislation. So we're complaining about it or not, the key thing I'm doing is, how do I get a slice of that? And one of the ways to get a slice of that is to make sure that I'm establishing industries that, yes, would decarbonize my country and my neighbors, but would decarbonize their industries as well. So I have a greater opportunity to get some money from the EU Innovation Fund. And then, that won't happen automatically because they feel bad for Namibia. It'll happen if I spend a lot of time, for example, putting in place a vehicle like a transparent fund where that money can go in, and which is what we've done in Namibia. And then that fund, so for example, we have this thing called the SDG Namibia 1 fund that it will invest in hydrogen projects and hydrogen related infrastructure. That fund, we've hired a fund manager from South Africa, actually. Climate fund managers owned 50% by Sanlam and FMO. We've then partnered them up with a Namibian fund manager. They've set up this fund, and now they're investing in hydrogen projects in Namibia, but including hydrogen pipelines into South Africa, port infrastructure, transmission lines, etc. And that fund could be a potential vehicle to receive money from the innovation fund. Just an idea, right? And so my sort of effort to Africans, or at least my plea to Africans, would be to say, these things are kind of already happening. How do we position ourselves to benefit from them? And be careful of the amount of time we spend complaining about these systemic trends that may not actually turn around at all. That would be my 2 cents.
And just to add very quickly into the mix, I think we should all just be cognitive of the fact that the whole, globally, the whole international financing architecture, there's a lot of talk of reform. Again, it's one of those things that's in transition. So I'm a glass half full person. I think there are many, many opportunities, and we're seeing signals already. If one looks at sort of the Bridgetown Initiative, one looks at green bonds, there are many, many things there that we're just seeing the beginning of. The point being, I think that as the African continent, the better prepared we are for this, the better. Kind of get onto the forefoot, not be on the back foot the whole time, and wait around and sit and see what money is coming our way to do what with. And then I also just wanted to add quickly, Elise, you ended with, climate change and the funding needed for that. And I want to add into the mix, it's not just about adaptation and mitigation. I think what's critically important is resilience. Locally developed resilience, and resilience here, not in the sense of shocks happen, and they will happen, and they're going to be bad, and that one has the ability to recover from shock, but resilience to transform, to change in the face of change, and calling sort of on African innovativeness and doing things differently, and because there aren't recipes out there or development models or pathways or things that we can easily follow. So in a funny sort of way, I think there is massive scope and opportunity for really tackling the problems coming our way. But it's going to need concerted effort, and it's going to need cross-cutting collaboration.
Thank you, Tanya and James. I think what we're hearing, and I'm not sure I entirely agree, James, that CBAM is a global tax. I think it's a unilateral response to the lack of global consensus to level the playing field within Europe. It's not a protectionist tax at all, but it is a unilateral decision. But it may have a similar effect. It drives certain incentives to make countries consider the effect of that tax when they consider their policies. But I think that the bifurcation here, and it's been alluded to on some points of the chat, and I'm going to ask one or two of the people on the chat if they'd like to add their views, is that a global carbon tax to me sounds like it's a wholly collaborative affair. Yeah, it's people coming together. It's the 195 signatories to the Paris Agreement saying, okay, we're going to get together and agree on a tax. This is going to be the level. It's going to be a negotiation for this country. This is the level for this country. This is how it's going to be dispersed, etc., etc., etc. Whereas what we have seen in the past, what we tend to see with a more multipolar world, what we're seeing is a more transactive response to the same problem. So CBAM is a transactive response. Namibia's response to CBAM is potentially transactive. Let's make ourselves more attractive. And there were a couple of comments. I knew this was going to stimulate a little bit of debate. Hopefully one or two of the people who made the comments will share their views on the chat. About one of them was saying, is it not time for Africa to stand up and fulfill her role on the global stage? And I think that was Mr. Larry Schwartz. And then I think, where is he? Patrice Young Lumumba was saying, Africa has always been subjected to assistance in major world issues, whereas it is the richest continent in the world. And the sense I'm getting from those comments, and please, if one of you are willing to share your thoughts, then please do, is that Africa needs to take more responsibility for its, whether that's Africa as a continent or that's the individual countries in Africa, much like Namibia is doing, needs to take more responsibility for its role in global affairs and the way it wants to move forward in terms of the transition. I don't know if Patrice or is it Larry wants to comment on that, but they're two almost opposing views: global collaboration and sort of unilateral transactive response. And I wonder where we're going to end up for all the benefits of looking at the Foresight models and where we would like to end up. Is it going to be something in between, or are we going to actually end up in a purely transactive state where Europe and the US and to a certain extent China drives the policies that the rest of the world has to follow from a transactive perspective?
Roland, if I could make a last comment on this before we step off of this topic, it's just to say that, I mean, I agree with your comment on the CBAM, but just to mention, like, some of the largest emitters, like China and the US, for instance, they don't have national carbon taxing at all. They've got a little bit of either a subnational carbon tax, or they've got an emission trading system, subnational emission trading systems. But so this is the point. These large emitters are not being taxed for their carbon emissions. So, I mean, you mentioned that this is going to be it needs to be a global affair, something like the Paris Agreement, to be able to make this work, which I agree with. And there has been really excellent reports by the IMF and the World Bank that has published on how modalities around this could look like in terms of a financing and the implementation of this. I think we do reference one or two of those in our report as well.
Thank you, Elise. I don't see any hands, and I don't see that Patrice or Larry wants to add their comments. I don't think, unless there are other questions from the panel, I mean, we could continue debating the outcomes of the Foresight, and I think it'll be very interesting to quiz James on what he's up to in Namibia. But I don't see any further comments that can really be addressed. James, please go ahead.
Yeah, I'll say something. Yeah, go ahead.
Can I ask a question?
Please.
Before James comes in. Thank you. Thank you very much. Very quickly, and James may respond. Given all that James has said, and that was very much appreciated, what is how does this relate to the discovery of lots of oil, offshore oil in Namibia, which is sort of carbon energy based? And Namibia is emerging as the new oil giant in the region. So just factor that in, James, and how does it relate to your modeling going forward? Thank you, Santu.
I think that's a super critical question. Roland, do you want me to add or to respond, or did you want to collect another question?
James, I don't see any other questions, so please go ahead.
Great. So I'll give you my subjective opinion and on both of these things, and not necessarily James, who's a member of the Namibian government, but I think this is somebody called Elspeth Mearns. She says, sometimes trying to get global agreement on anything, never mind redistributing money, will take far too long, right? And that goes hand in hand with a lot of global initiatives. And unfortunately, for us in particular, we're really running out of time, right? We have the second highest level of inequality in the world. We have a 33% unemployment. And while we keep on debating all of these like more equitable means every day, like we keep getting hammered by climate change. So we have to get on with it and try and develop our nation the best way we can while trying to be a responsible global citizen and helping those emitters actually reduce their emissions, right? And I'm happy to work with any of them, whether they are South Africa, the EU, Australia, or China, right? If you really think about what we're doing, we will import equipment from China. We may sell molecules to Europe and to South Africa, and we will build a lot of gross fixed capital formation in Namibia. It's a global effort, right? And whether that's being funded by CBAM, a Japanese bank, or indeed the IDC in South Africa, for a guy who has a 33% unemployment and needs infrastructure development, I try to spend less time, I think, debating things that might take very long to get done. Of course, I listen and we read as much as we can to make sure that what we're doing is potentially sustainable. I think the question from Salome is extremely critical. So as we're building this green industrialization blueprint, oil and gas discoveries have been made. My personal opinion is the acceleration of those oil and gas discoveries are not uncorrelated or unrelated to how fast we've started building the green ecosystem. I do think that the animal that is the hydrocarbon global industry is responding to the threats, right, that are emerging to its potential long-term business model. And I think the way they're manifesting in Namibia is accelerated production of oil that is 300 kilometers offshore and 3 kilometers deep. It is some of the most complex oil assets to develop, but yet they're being developed as fast as they can. What are we doing about this? One of the things I'm asking my government to think very hard is, do you want to ingest any of those hydrocarbons into your ecosystem, aka gas to power, for example, increase the carbon dioxide content of your electricity, obviously then increasing the carbon content of the goods that you make? Or do you want to pull a bit of a Norway, extract the hydrocarbons, sell them to those who are addicted to these hydrocarbons, including Europe? Europe is going to be the largest consumer of this stuff, for example, and use those revenues to build a more resilient economic ecosystem that is low carbon nature. Norway did that. Norway's grid is 100% clean. They have lots of hydro, but they sell the oil and gas to the rest of us who are addicted to this stuff. That requires some modeling, and we're busy with that modeling. But roughly, that's how I look at it, is countries like Namibia and pretty much everyone else in the world, at the moment, it doesn't look like they're going to stop exploring for these hydrocarbons for as long as there are consumers in the world that help those companies generate 23 to 30-something% returns for extracting those hydrocarbons. The day the guy in the Autobahn in Germany says he doesn't want to drive his V12 anymore, and the return on investment for Shell is like 2%, is the day you're going to impact oil. And that's a long journey. So Namibia, Senegal, the United States is exploring for oil in Alaska. They're the richest country in the world. Saudi keeps on pumping its oil. Nigeria will keep on doing so. Australia keeps on selling its natural gas. And so I'm trying as best as I can to reduce the carbon content of a lot of these hard to abate sectors. And I'm happy to use the revenues from the hydrocarbons to actually accelerate my ability to provide these solutions. And I think that's what we're seeing in Oman, Australia, Saudi Arabia, the United States, even the EU, where these nations have a lot of hydrocarbons, but they're pumping a lot of incentives to build greener ecosystems. And as far as I'm concerned, in Namibia, we're behind the curve from them. So, you know, we have to use the resources that we have. One last thing I will say, Namibia, and you have to think about this, Namibia is not developing oil and gas. Shell and Total are developing oil and gas, and they're both backed by Qatar Energy, right? They are the ones who sunk the billions of dollars to recover these hydrocarbons. The Namibian government didn't spend that money. We merely met our contractual obligation because we had signed those oil concessions a long time ago. So that's very useful for people to think about. And then when you look at Total's annual report and you look at the biggest consumers of their products, it's the same Europeans that are also funding the projects to build the green hydrogen, the green ammonia, and the DRI. So it requires a very nuanced lens of how to look at the world when you want to look at these ecosystems. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Wonderful. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Anyone else like to respond to that question? If not, I have a question. So I don't see any hands. So I think the conversation and that question and answer adds some granularity to what Elise mentioned earlier about, and I think Jackie has also mentioned it on the chat, that in terms of that graph where you show the declining global emissions, but increasing African emissions, Africa is in terms of your modeling and your forecasts, in terms of the foresight, Africa is allowed to continue to develop its oil and gas resources, potentially only its gas resources, but anyway, fossil fuel resources, where the rest of the world is effectively weaning itself off and accelerating its green transition. So Africa, it sort of implicitly becomes more of an engine for that supply than it is currently, in terms of probably proportionately in terms of production around the world. And that contributes to that increase in emissions from Africa over the next 40 odd years or so. I think from memory, your chart showed, was it 11 or 16% of global emissions by 2063, I think, but whatever it was, significantly higher than now. So my question is there a future that you've looked at or modeled where that doesn't happen, where the monetization of the resources that James has talked about does not drive a transition, or does not contribute so much to a transition, that a transition can happen much more aggressively without the exploitation of fossil fuels? And I think James is trying to balance both. Yeah, he's saying let's in order to accelerate our green transition locally, we will develop oil and gas, or not we, because it's not Namibia, but Shell and whoever else will develop Namibian oil and gas to export. But is there a path to similar outcomes where that doesn't happen, that's left in the ground, and a transition happens in Africa that is much more aggressively renewable?
So, Roland, I'm going to try and answer that, and I do see Passy has her hand up, so just to note that. Just quickly, Roland, so when we did this forecasting, we did look at, like I said, completely taking gas, oil, and coal out of the mix and focusing on boosting renewables, and we the forecast showed we are left with a production gap. So there's a gap that can't be filled by the current technologies that's on the market. Even if you fourfold increase the uptake of that and you introduce energy efficiency, currently as it stands, we need more novel solutions to be able to fill that gap. So I think that was the reality from what we do. So there are things on the horizon that can change this game. So we do acknowledge that, and they have not been considered in the modeling. So while we have increased nuclear in the forecast, we didn't increase it aggressively. And the SMNR technologies, it's currently being developed, and there are a couple of pilots. I mean, if they come to full-scale production and commercialization, that can also be a game changer. So there are things on the horizon that can shift this picture, but we're not seeing this being shifted in the next decade, at least, given everything that's currently on the table. So just to answer your question about taking gas off of the table.
You, Elise, and sorry, Passy, I didn't see your hand up, but please jump in.
That's okay. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for the presentations today. I had a question, but then I've been triggered to make a comment by what James said about the people who are actually the ones developing the oil and gas in the continent. I mean, Total and Shell. I mean, the only thing that came to my mind was it's a critical question to ask for the people who argue that it's time for Africa to develop using its hydrocarbons, given that other parts of the world did that. But even if you were to go with that narrative, another question raises up, which is who actually owns those oil and gas reserves? So that was just a question, but my comment. But my question is to you, James, as you and your country are looking at creating the blueprint for a green industrialization in Namibia, how are you working on introducing other stakeholders to those conversations? And I'm particularly interested in the youth. As we have seen around the world, the youth population is increasingly rising. They don't have jobs, unemployment, and we're talking about an energy transition that is moving fast, but also has to be just. Is there a framework for reskilling, upskilling, and plugging in elements of literacy and education for the technical skills needed for a truly industrialized, green industrialized Namibia? And if so, how are you doing that? And I asked because I was in Namibia a couple of weeks ago and had very interesting conversation with the Namibia Youth Energy Forum about the future of Namibia and the green energy transition. So I'd be really keen to hear what your opinion is on the future generations. Thank you.
Roland, do you want to answer that, or?
Please go ahead, James.
Cool. Thanks, Pasi, for your question. Look, I think maybe, again, I'll speak on behalf of James and not yet the Namibian government, but we have this conversation in the government all the time. I'm not sure that my biggest goal is to industrialize my nation and not to create a few jobs for tomorrow, but to create like a multi-decade competitive advantage, right? In whatever it is that I'm doing. Like, you think of South Korea and the transition they made. You think of China and how they lifted 500 million people out of poverty, right? These guys were not looking to make like an electrolyzer factory. You know, the government met, I think, a few days ago when they have this once in a 5-year sort of gathering in China, right, of all their senior government officials. And they sit and they craft plans on how to make China dominant for the next 2, 3, 4, 5 decades, right? And I'm trying to sit and think the same way as my government, right? So there is noise, right? This model, that model, that model, but there is an opportunity for me to skill my people to make equipment that will be needed for the next few decades. And I can do that because there's a big enough project in Namibia that'll offtake that equipment. Say, for example, you're talking about electrolyzers. So how should I be looking at that as an opportunity set? And I can become an exporter of electrolyzers into Southern Africa, if not the continent, with assets that could give me that generational advantage. South Africa did that with their coal. They took their coal, they built Sasol, they were treating aluminium, right? And they attracted energy-intensive industries on the back of that natural endowment, and they built a really complex industrial complex that they now obviously have to figure out how to adjust. I'm trying to do the same thing. To do that, I absolutely have to put skills development at the core of what I'm doing. But let me tell you this as well, Pasi. I looked at Qatar. Qatar, $7 billion GDP a while ago, 400,000 population. Qatar today, $250 billion GDP, 2.6 million people that live there. There's still about 300,000 to 400,000 Qataris in Qatar. Qatar was able to host the World Cup a few months ago, right, or last year. The people who built the stadiums were not Qataris. They were people from Pakistan and India and China and others, right? So Namibia, like any other African country, has to realize that to fully unleash all of our economic potential, we will need to import some labor, right? And be very strategic about what labor we're importing. Of course, how many jobs we can create locally, but never lose that, of course, a big part of the objective is to build sustainably competitive industries that are making goods that are high in demand. And along the way, you will create other jobs for your locals as well. So that healthy balance is super critical. Everyone says the US, is the largest economy in the world, but it was built on the back of immigrants. And people don't stop, I think, to pause and reflect on that enough. So that conversation is going to be tough in Namibia. By the way, it's going to be tough anywhere around the world, especially if you have a 33% unemployment rate. But I do think it's at the core of, it should be at the core of anyone's economic strategy. Because you have to compete. And by the way, I think somebody else was saying, oil and gas, hydrogen. The key thing is, by the way, both of them are actually the same molecule. People also forget, right? Like hydrogen, whether it's gray or green, it's still hydrogen. If you develop the capability to deal with ammonia or hydrogen, and you inherently use all of the money you'll make from selling the gray stuff to entrench a competitive advantage with the green stuff, the two are not just like they're the same. They're super related, and I think we have to leverage all of the advantages that we have, whether it's hydrocarbons or renewable energy assets. The key is make sure that your products are attractive and in demand for the next 2-3 decades. So don't just obsess about coal, or oil-dominated products that might be taxed to uncompetitive eventualities. It's more complex, of course, than that, but roughly, this is how I look at this, Pasi. I think fantastic question. So a real question for us, for example, is how many Zimbabweans and South Africans should we be importing into Namibia to build this continental stronghold? And I know in South Africa, this didn't play out very well. I know in the world at the moment, this is not playing out very well. But I think the country that manages to figure that out nicely, you look at London, New York, Singapore, these large complex economies, they do have immigrants within the ecosystem. And the moment the EU went super hard, or at least London went super hard on immigrants, inflation went up because local labor was not willing to pick oranges or clean like the gutters, right? So it's complex, but it's worthwhile pausing and thinking about it. Roland, back to you. Thanks.
Thank you, James. I think that's a great question to leave hanging and to end the conversation on. I'm not sure many of the fruit pickers in the UK were picking oranges, but well, not with the rainfall in the UK, but yeah.
In California, the orange pickers were the Mexicans, and then Trump wanted to build the wall, right? So guess what that's going to do to their inflation? So think about stuff like that.
Yeah, absolutely. But we're a little over time, so apologies for that for anyone who needed to leave at 12:30. But I just a quick closing comments. I've been on all three of these seminars, and I think there's been a lot of thought-provoking discussion and some fascinating insights provided by the Foresight crew. And so thank you very much for that. But it's also been interesting hearing some different views, and on this particular discussion, we've heard policy proposals from the Foresight team and how that could impact the future of global carbon emissions. And then we've heard some very real, pragmatic, project-based solutions that have been implemented in Namibia with a very comprehensive overview of a strategy for a country, which I think is very interesting, putting the two side by side, the global approach and the local approach. So for me, it's been a very interesting discussion. I think some of the speakers have been absolutely fantastic. All the speakers have been absolutely fantastic. If I can just sort of summarize what the Foresight team have been saying, it seems that there's going to need to be a lot more global discussion in order to certainly implement the carbon tax, but to agree on a consensus of a way forward. And that's going to be a challenge, I think, but it's going to be something that we should, I agree, we should all work towards. The more that we can agree on a path forward, the better it will be for everyone. But I think just to the final comments are just thank you to everyone who's participated, in particular the Africa Futures and Innovation team, the Institute for Security Studies and the Global Future Society, and our 3 speakers today, Elise, Tanya and James, all of whom have provided some fascinating insights. And lastly, and certainly not leastly, all the attendees for joining. This wouldn't have been anything without you listening in and putting your opinions and asking your questions. So thank you. So thank you for that. So on that, I'd just like to say thank you very much, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of the